Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I'm Rami Khouri, Director of the Issam Faris Institute, and I just want to welcome you all and to say how pleased we are to co-host this lecture by Dr. Ellen Lust from Yale University, co-hosted with the Yale Arab Alumni Association, and in collaboration with the Department of Political Studies and Public Administration at AUB and the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies at AUB, frequent partners of ours in holding events like this. I will ask now George Abdenour, who is the president of the Yale Arab Alumni Association, to make a few comments, and then I will introduce Dr. Lust in more detail, and then we will start with the talk. And please, if I can remind everybody to turn off your cell phones, please, or put them on silent. Thank you. Tfaddal, George.
Good afternoon. I've been told I need to cut down on my presentation. But I don't often have the opportunity to put in a plug for the Yale Arab Alumni Association. My name is George Abdenour. I'm president of the Yale Arab Alumni Association, and I'm here to say thank you. And special thanks to the American University of Beirut as an institution, because they've been with us from the very beginning and have supported our various activities. But Rami Khouri at the Issam Faris Institute in particular. For those of you who do not know, our association is relatively young. We were founded in 2008 and began our programming almost immediately. In 2009, we had a conference on the future of the Arab city, and that was where Rami came in to make it happen. Who is the Yale Arab Alumni Association? We're a nonprofit, 501c3 organization registered in Connecticut, comprising Yale alumni who have an academic and professional interest in the Arab world. A membership that is quite transnational. You'll find them all over the globe, but clearly most of them are here in the region. Our board, which I represent today and on whose behalf I would like to thank everyone for coming, comprises 11 members, and they are located in cities as diverse as Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Beirut, Boston, New York, Berkeley, Istanbul. I might have forgotten something, some city somewhere along the way. The speaker series is our latest program on behalf of alumni, for alumni, and for the communities in which we live. But we do many other things as well. Peter May, who is VP for Legal Affairs at AUB and who also sits on our board, is quite aware of the different things that we do. For the third year in a row, for example, we've put together a scholarship for a Yale undergraduate to come and undertake a project of his or her choosing, but with the ultimate aim of actually engaging with people in the region. This will be the third year that we offer that. As I mentioned, our conference in 2009, which took place here in Beirut this past spring in May, we held our second conference, and that was in Doha, also on the future of the Arab city. We are currently working with the Arab Students Association at Yale with a program called Tadrib to identify internship opportunities during the summer for Yale undergraduates to come to the region and work in the region and get to know the region and engage with the region. We have a very simple mission. That is to take Yale's message of public service and bring it to the communities in which we live. In so doing, we're trying to build connections between Yale University and leading institutions in our region, and for that reason, we are very happy to be here. And I think we're doing a good job thus far. I just want to end with a word of thanks. Again, to the American University of Beirut, but also to Rami Khouri once more, Issam Faris Institute, to the President's Office, to the Provost's Office, to AUB's Department of Political Studies and Public Administration, to the Center for Middle Eastern Arab Studies, and a special thanks to Ellen Lust, who is probably our biggest champion within Yale, who's been an advisor from the very beginning, who sits on our advisory board. And so, Ellen, welcome to Beirut, and thank you for coming.
So now we get to the main part of our event today. Dr. Ellen Lust will be giving a talk about why Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt face different obstacles to democratization, parties, polarization, and political transition. She will talk about the different trajectories in these countries and the process of political transition and the reasons for them, the stakes, and the issues that lead to these different trajectories. Dr. Lust is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Yale University. She's written many books, including Structuring Conflict in the Arab World, Political Participation in the Middle East, Governing Africa's Changing Societies, The Middle East, an edited textbook, and the forthcoming book, Taking to the Streets, The Transformation of Arab Activism, which is co-edited with Lina Khatib. And Lina, I think, has just recently come to Beirut as director of the Carnegie Center, so we'll be seeing her soon here, we hope. She's now writing a book about Dr. Lust is writing a book about the politics of elections in the Arab world, and another jointly authored volume on the Egyptian transitions. And she's a prolific writer and scholar. We're very happy to have her, and I would welcome her to come up and give her talk. And she'll talk for about 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll have an open discussion. تفضلي. Help me welcome her.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear if I stand? I'm just more used to standing, to be honest with you. So does that work? Okay. Does the recording work? Yanni. Okay. Is that better? Okay, great. Okay, now I feel like a singer. So thank you very, very much, both for the warm welcome and for all of you for coming. I really appreciate it. And what I want to present today is, in a sense, somewhat of a new project. So I'm really also very much looking forward to a chance to debate and discuss it, and we'll try to make it, you won't feel like this, but I will try to make it sort of short and sweet so that we can get to a discussion. The first thing that I want to note, though, before I talk about the obstacles to democratization, is that this is really work that without this kind of little mini international team that I have and that I work with. It's not my team, we are a team. It wouldn't be possible. So it includes, you see me here, so you know me, but it includes Lindsay Benstead, who's an assistant professor at Portland State University, Dafr Malouche, who is a statistician and a professor at Essay in Tunis, Gamal Sultan, who is at AUC, and Jacob Wichman, who is a Danish consultant with JMW Consulting. And we've had the chance to do a number of surveys and a lot of other work as well. You'll see data in here that's coming from 3 surveys, one being this DCPSS-DD post-election survey, a second that was done in Egypt, a second one that was similar done in Tunisia, a third that was done in Libya, all roughly 1 year after the elections that were taking place, and they were founded by the NSF, the National Science Foundation in the States, the Danish MFA, CMAP, Portland State, Princeton, and Yale. So before I started, I just want to make sure that there's sort of an appropriate recognition of what's essentially behind this. They are responsible for none of the things you disagree with or that you find problematic or challenging about this presentation. I want to start with what I think is a fairly obvious but nevertheless important observation, which is that not all of the processes that are taking place are the same, and not all of the sort of are similarly kind of difficult. And it's not only about the outcomes, it's also about the process, right? So there's a tendency, I think, to have this, especially maybe in the West more than over here, but to have this kind of broad sweeping, is it an Arab Spring? Is it an Islamist winter? This kind of notion about thinking about all of these processes as being somehow similar both in the process, right, but also in some ways in the outcomes. And while it's true that in the sort of academic literature there's been more of a discussion lately about what's the difference in terms of outcomes and why does Syria fall apart and why does Tunisia sort of see, you know, kind of an leave relatively easily. So there's that kind of a discussion. But it's one then that focuses very strongly on what's been the outcome of the uprisings or the outcome of the challenge, and not so much there's been a question about what is the process that's taking place and how might those differ. And I would argue that there's actually quite a lot of difference in the processes. And I'm sure are all very familiar with what's taking place in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya. But I just want to sort of briefly highlight how I see these as different. So in Egypt, of course, we know we've seen major difficulties that led up to Morsi's fall, but that I would argue were primarily focused on challenges about the institutions themselves. Challenges over liberal institutions. And so we saw, of course, the problems in terms of, first, the disbandment of parliament, which was done through sort of the Supreme Court decision, but nevertheless had kind of a sense in which there was a side that actually didn't mind so much seeing the disbandment of Parliament because it felt that it had too much of a Muslim Brother kind of influence in it. We've seen the kind of the subsequent fitful sort of experience with the Constituent Assembly, which of course we saw the first and then the second form. Finally, we saw that sometimes the opposition took to the streets, sometimes it took to the ballot boxes. It was kind of very obviously dramatic, and that it all was also couched in these strong fights over association laws, civil liberties, sort of the kinds of liberal political institutions that often underpin democracy, right? So it's an institutional struggle that we saw there. I would argue that's quite different than what we see in Libya. In Libya, I would argue that we are actually seeing much more of a struggle that's about sort of an arms, and it's the threat of arms that keep people sort of at bay, and that also that are sort of becomes the political pressure points. So we see militias surrounding the foreign ministry, for example, and other government buildings. We see the abduction of the prime minister and all of the kind of the consternation that goes around that. We see continued presence of the militias and the problems with them. And at the same time, the General National Congress, albeit very, very weak, right? The elections, the civil liberties, and the association laws, all of those remain relatively uncontested, right? They don't have a lot of legitimacy, they don't have a lot of teeth, but nobody is sort of pushing to try to tear them down in the same way that they did in Egypt. Tunisia represents kind of, I would argue, somewhat of a middle case, right? And in many ways, I mean, if you had a choice of being Libyan, Tunisian, or Egyptian at the moment, I would argue that it may be slightly easier to be Tunisian, even though I realize there are many Tunisians who would probably disagree with that. But they've seen, of course, times of moments of violence, both with the assassinations, right, of Brahmi and Baled. They've also seen, sort of this kinds of tensions and increasing concerns and threats about sort of Islamists and the violence that surrounds them. They've seen in some sort of, again, more minor ways, sort of the problems with the walkout of the Constituent Assembly members who had refused essentially to come back until the sort of the solution and the change of government. So you've seen that kind of a stress, but it's not been as much of a stress about things like association laws and civil liberties and sort of the parliament itself as it had been in Egypt, and it hasn't been as much about sort of militias and arms as it had been in Libya. So I would argue that we're actually seeing very, very different, not only paths, but I think we see very different what I call obstacles to democracy, right? And we can sort of briefly think of these, or kind of roughly think of them as, on the one hand, the problem of arms, right? Is it about sort of, the continued presence of militias and the concern with arms as being a way of tearing down the process? Or is it about the fight over institutions and the kinds of civil liberties that those institutions are intended to protect that become the sort of the major kind of focal point in the stress? So, again, kind of more stylized Libya on the one hand versus Egypt on the other. So why does this happen? I'll tell you the argument. I'll present the evidence so you can see if you agree or disagree. I think that what's happening is that we have really sort of, at the very basis of this, we have very different political cleavages that are being activated. We have very different, essentially, then, targets of contestation. So what do I mean by political cleavages? Kind of, in a very rough way, we can think of two types of cleavages. So on the one hand, we have what I call universal and kind of ideological cleavages. These are things like the debate over the role of religion in the state, right? The Islamist versus the secularists, to stylize it, right? And what's interesting about that cleavage and what's interesting about that contest is that when that's at stake, I can imagine, if I'm an Islamist, I can imagine that people can become more secularist, and I can imagine, of course, that they can become more Islamist. I can imagine that any individual is essentially up for grabs of being in my camp or being in your camp. Okay, so that's sort of, I think, the fundamental basis of that is a cleavage. It's a very different cleavage than a distributive, what I call a distributive or particularistic cleavage, right? And in that case, the issue is not so much that I think you're going to change, you're going to want what I want, or vice versa. It's the fact that I actually think that what we have at stake are unchanging groups who are fighting over essentially resources. Right? And so the idea for, if we're talking about Libya, is not that a Libyan in Benghazi thinks suddenly that the person in Tripoli is going to change and want what they want. They know they're not going to want what they want. They can roughly count how many people they can count on to support their side, and have very little expectation that if they win or lose today, that tomorrow, right, and this is the issue. The issue is for Islamists, they think if the secularists win today, they will corrupt society and more people will actually support them, and vice versa. The secularists are very afraid that if Islamists win, and they will say this, what will happen if, you're telling me there's moderates out there, but what will happen if the Muslim Brothers stay in power for a long time, right? They will all become Islamists, right? So that's the fear there. But that's not the fear in this case. So the fear here is simply that if I'm not able to fight you, if I'm not able to get what I want, even if you win today, it's not going to change what my people want, right? So the result, of course, is, again, one is a fear of conversion, one is a fear of distributive conflict, but how I hedge against that, how I try to sort of combat that is very different. So if I'm in the case where now I fear that the other side can make its case and win the game tomorrow, then all of a sudden these liberal institutions are actually very, very threatening to me, right? Because the more that people can make their case and the more that they can sort of put in place laws and all of the things that parliaments do and associations and media can do mean that the other side, or the side that's on the losing today, can actually win tomorrow. So that's why you'll find that, some people stayed relatively quiet, both from the early period of disbanding the parliament and even with the overthrow of Morsi. Now, if I'm interested in the sort of distributive conflicts, then the question is, so what happens if I'm not able to have the numbers that keep me in power? And there the issue is, now I'm going to turn instead to trying to hedge my bets by making sure that if I can't win at the ballot box, I can win in the streets. I can win with the arms. And so the result then, right, is going to be not that you're going to want to undermine the institutions, because that's not going to have that same effect for you, but now you're going to want to make sure that you maintain your militia. So it's a very stark example of this. I was in Libya and was talking to a Libyan, Ali Sanusi is a Libyan party, he's a militia head, but he also has a political party, and he was showing me the dossier that he was going to be handing in to register the party, right? So he very proudly showed me the organizational chart and the numbers of petitions of the signatures that people would be members and all of the kind of this very, very thick file. And then he took out a poster and he turned it over and he has a grand smile on his face. He takes out 2 stamps, and he stamps the first one. He says, "This is my stamp as the party." And then he stamps out the second and says, "This is my stamp as the militia." Right? And he says, and I tell the guys, it's okay. I'm not telling you to get rid of your arms. I'm not telling you that we're changing what we do, but today we play as a party. Right? So that to me is the very big difference. Now, why do we want to think of this? I think we want to think of this because really the existing literature, I think, misses these points, right? So we have a whole set of structuralist literature, and so if I'm trying to make the case that these are different and this is why you care, but there's a whole set of structural explanations that should be out there that tell us why it could be easier in Tunisia or harder in Libya, etc. I don't actually think that they do a very good job of explaining why it is that you see the differences that we're seeing, right? So partly they don't do a very good job of explaining it because they pay less attention to the difference of process and more attention to the difference of outcome. So in a sense, from the very outset, we're asking different questions, right? But in addition to that, I don't think they happen to sort of do a very good job of predicting. So if you're thinking, I mean, there's not a very good theory out this, but I happen to have always believed that, in a sense, small states have it easier to try to solve these problems, right? Then, of course, Libya should have it easiest of all. It doesn't seem to be the case, right? Ethnic diversity, if you think that that sort of matters, your Horowitz, then it doesn't actually seem to be what's at play here. If you're thinking about religion and the question about, does Islam, is that the reason why it becomes difficult to have a process towards democratization? Then at best, there's a bit of a difference in Egypt, and obviously, and I'll show you in a second. Then also, it doesn't seem to matter when we're looking at opinions about these things. But basically, religion doesn't seem to explain it. GDP per capita doesn't seem to explain it. So it's not the it's not the kind of the Boyce and the Jaworski argument. The percentage of oil wealth doesn't seem to be a very good predictor, nor the international linkages, if you're Levitsky in a way, right? So there's a whole set of explanations out there that, first of all, are focused on a very different variable, but even if you were trying to sort of explain them with regards to this, you wouldn't find them as making making the case. We can also talk about why I think the agentic and other explanations aren't particularly helpful, but again, I want to get sort of the argument out from this. So, again, back to sort of thinking about, are there other things that matter? It doesn't seem to result from a sort of straightforward public values or attitudes towards religion in the state. Essentially, if we're thinking, this is a weird question, is religious leaders should not influence government, so sort of almost invert it in your mind if you're thinking about their interest in supporting government. But essentially, right, you've got this sort of the most disagreement on that in Libya. And interestingly enough, as we'll see, we also see that in Libya we had the least, as we all know, right? And Libya was, according to the headlines, the one place where the green wave didn't take place, right? So it doesn't seem to be simply about the attitudes towards this any more than it is about the sort of the general extent to which we have different religious represented. And I would argue it's also not about the main sort of views on the characteristics of democracy or even support for democracy. It's not here, but generally about 80 to 90% of those sort of surveyed in any of these, if you say, do you support democracy, do you agree with the statement that democracy is better than any other form of government, most people, vast majorities of 80 to 90% say, yes, it is. Now, when you ask them, and I think this is just actually interesting in and of itself, when you ask them, what is actually democracy? You will find, and I think this is so important for us all to keep in mind, that for a lot of people, democracy is either narrowing the gap between the rich and the poor, right? Or it's making sure that basic necessities have been provided. In other words, for a lot of people, democracy is about economic equality more than it is about democratic freedoms that we all think or at least in the West, a lot of people think that this is what they're supporting, right? That's not the case. But then when you look at it, it's not that it's not really that in Tunisia, for instance, there's a greater percentage who think that this is about the government changing through elections or the kinds of things that we think about civil and political liberties than it really is, for example, in Libya, right? So that's not really explaining. It's not that the people have a better conception about democracy in Libya or in Tunisia and therefore know what the process should look like and therefore have a different process. That doesn't seem to be it either. I would argue in some ways that to understand why we have these very different processes, and this is a very strange argument for sort of a strict institutionalist like me to make, by the way, but I would argue that actually it has a lot to do with the political cleavages that have come to the fore following the falls of these regimes, and the ways in which the experiences before that, both the authoritarian strategy and the effects of that, had affected what kinds of parties existed, how people then responded to these parties, what kinds of fears existed among the populations, etc. Okay? So what we saw, for example, in Egypt, right, and we all know this, is that we had what I have called in the Structures of Contestation book, sort of this divided structures of contestation. In other words, you kept the Muslim Brothers and the Islamists illegal, even though you let them play enough to become strong enough as a threat, and you constantly told the secularists, who you let sort of have parties and the Waft and the Tajammo, etc., that you told them that this was, Mubarak was better than an alternative, right? So that was how it stayed in power. But the result of that, of course, was that there's a very strong fear among secularists of Islamists, and a very sort of strong fear, frankly, of Islamists that secularists are only only interested in, today of course you can see why they believe this even more, but are only interested in basically sort of putting them back in the underground. And so essentially the historical sort of experience of the situation had led then to this really strong secularist Islamist cleavage. And in some ways it was kind of reinforcing a cleavage that had existed since the early part of the century. So that's the Egyptian situation, right? And so it means that in some ways it's not surprising that when you get to the post-period, I mean, for the very, very early period, if you look in the sort of February, or end of February and early March, right? Even there, you start to see these discussions. And by the time that the SCAF sort of forms the Constituent Assembly for kind of revising the Constitution and puts one Brotherhood person on and no sort of real representatives of the secularists, then essentially the fears that this is going to be a Muslim brother military alliance that's going to lead to a situation that basically retracts what the secularists see as their sets of freedoms is already existing and very strong as by the time we get to April, May, June, right? So it's quite early that will then emerge. Again, that's a very different situation, I would argue, than it was in Libya, right? So in Libya, what had happened? We'd seen that all of the parties, of course, had been banned, right? So it was essentially, even there was no president technically in Libya. There was a sort of, in a sense, kind of, it was the anti-institution sets of institutions, right? You'd had some nonpartisan elections, and you'd had councils that were then sort of aggregated up into the General People's Congress. But generally, in sort of terms of my earlier work, it was called an undivided structure of contestation. But more importantly, it led to essentially sort of a kind of a muting of the political cleavage between Islamists and secularists. Even though, and very importantly, it is probably, it is the most conservative in terms of sort of religion of the three cases, right? It's the only dry country of these cases. It is the one case in which, there's a sort of one questions like, sort of women's rights and as we saw earlier also on questions of religion, is kind of the most striking of the three. Okay. Now at the same time though, of course, two things had happened. One is that we're actually looking at a place where regional sort of differences have always been very present, right? So it's only actually it's three provinces under the Ottoman Empire. It's only unified in 1912. At the time when it's unified, it's still a very sort of tense relationship, and it's a relationship that gets exacerbated by the fact that Gaddafi actually plays regions off against each other, right? So it's a place where regional divisions, and within those tribal divisions and sort of divisions between sort of localities, cities next to each other, has sort of long had a very, very strong presence. That gets overlaid, of course, by the fact that oil is unevenly distributed in the country, right? So in this way, oil does play a role, but it plays a role somewhat differently than what we were thinking of before, right? It plays a role in the fact that now, essentially, in the East, there's a great demand for making sure that the oil sort of wealth goes back to the East, right? So it has that kind of tensions. And the result, of course, is that we see that it's regional tensions that come to the fore, and that's the main sort of basis of a cleavage, not one that's so much about Islamist secularist debates. Finally, Tunisia. And Tunisia, again, is interesting, and in some ways it's a less kind of clean case than the other two. But in that, I think there's also a lesson. So, right, so in Tunisia, we have on the one hand, we have this sort of a set of parties that were legal, and Nahda and some other parties, of course, that were not. But it was very much a sort of the dominant party in Tunisia, the RCD, had more strength at the end of the day than the NDP had in Egypt. Right? But on the one hand, so yes, it's a divided country where there's sort of a notion and an existence of a strong Islamist party. So Nahda actually obviously emerges and does quite well in the post-rupture phase. But at the same time, of course, there had been such a proactive secularism that had taken place under Bourguiba, and to a slightly lesser extent, but still importantly under Ben Ali, right? So, the first things that, of course, that Bourguiba is doing after independence is to say women can't wear headscarves, and, you now can't, bans polygamy, and there's a lot of things with regards to women's rights, right? Also, essentially comes out very strongly, for example, against, fasting on Ramadan, right? And in fact, sort of, eating and drinking on TV during Ramadan itself. So clearly there's a way in which he tries to shape the society to be sort of more secularist. And the result, I think, is that in some ways, right, it's not to say, obviously, that there's no Islamists and religiosity doesn't play a role in Tunisia. It does, right? Much, frankly, to the consternation of a lot of Tunisians who look around at headscarves that have started to be worn, following the fall of the regime and say, that's not Tunisian, right? So there was a sense in which national identity and secularism became very, very closely linked. But the thing that was interesting about this is you also ask Tunisians if they're afraid that they could become Egypt, or if they're afraid that they could become Iran, of course, and they'll tell you Tunisians are different. So there is a sense among Tunisians where they often think that we're sort of more moderate, and we'll see some evidence of that as well. But generally, again, I think the way to think, and the other thing about Tunisia, which I haven't quite worked out as well, by the way, is that there is also a lot of, there's the interior coastal divide. So in some ways, you've got both sort of cleavages that play a little bit in here, right? So you've got a divide that's about the inequalities between the interior and the coast that is stronger than what we have in Egypt, and you have this divide that's about Islamists and secularists. I want to show you some survey evidence that I think shows this in a little bit, right? So the first, of course, is the Egyptian case, where we see, so what we've asked people to do is to say where they fit on the scale of 1 to 9 on the question of to what extent do you think that religion should play a strong role in the state, right? 1 being not, and 9 being a very high role. And then we've asked them for each of the parties. To what extent do you think, this party supports, where do you think that they fit on this scale? So we did this with the parties and we do this with the voters. And what we find is that both the people who vote for the parties as well as the parties themselves are actually quite polarized. Right? So people who are voting for the Egyptian bloc are actually quite secular. People who are voting for Alumni, for example, have want sort of a very strong relationship between those two. And they place the parties actually slightly kind of more extreme than their own positions, but they place their parties also very polarized. Now in Tunisia, it's interesting, right? So they also think that there's some polarization. There's some, obviously, sort of difference between the Nahda and the PDP or CPR or Arida, but they're not the same. It's neither the same degree of polarization, right? You don't have the sort of extremely sort of secularist position, nor is it that the polarization of the voters is as strong as that of the parties, right? So this is to say that the parties are taking positions that the voters think are a bit more extreme than themselves, even the position between the Nahda and the sort of the supporters and the parties. And so again, some polarization, but not nearly as much as we saw in Egypt. And in Libya, we have also, it's an interesting thing. We have polarization, and I can show this to you if you want to see it, but the polarization of where people place the parties, right? But very little in terms of where the voters themselves are sitting, right? So the voters themselves are all essentially, somewhat sort of clumped and relatively non-distinct. And at the same time, they think that the parties themselves, that the JCP really is an Islamist party, right? They think that the National Forces Alliance is really a secularist party. The other thing I think that happens to be interesting here is that they're totally aside, but they're a bit more to the sort of the capitalist side than either Tunisia or Egypt. So it just happens to be an interesting thing that in Libya, that's where they sit. But there's two points to be made. So clearly, it's the sort of the voters are more, if you think about it, more moderate. But the other way to think about this, and I'm trying to start testing this actually with some forthcoming surveys, is that the other way to understand when a person gives you sort of a 5, right, is that they actually don't care so much about that, right? So I would argue that it's not just about them being more moderate, it's about these as being less salient issues, right? So when I actually really care about something, I place myself at one of the extremes, I tend to, right? When it doesn't really matter, it's true that somebody can be very adamantly sort of moderate, but the reality is a lot of other people who don't care are simply going to place themselves in the center because that's how they're going to see it. Again, it's a correlation I want to check, but we haven't actually asked the right question to be able to do that yet. So the best I can do is to show you that at least when it came to voting for Islamists, that when we look at Libya, vis-a-vis either Tunisia or Egypt, that the attitudes about the role of state and religion plays obviously no role in whether or not you voted for an Islamist party. That's the best we can do at the moment to say, it doesn't seem to be that that's the cleavage that's dividing people, right? Because if it is, clearly they should be voting on that issue, and they're not. So when we look at why people voted for Islamists in Tunisia, for instance, they vote because of this sort of attitude on the ideological position of religion and about the practice, right? If we actually, why they voted for it in Egypt, it's about that, it's about religious identity. But when you ask in Libya, essentially nothing strongly comes up, and again, remember, first the Islamists did very poorly, but in addition to that, it just doesn't seem to be it's neither the identities are all relatively conservative, and the ideological cleavage just doesn't seem to matter. Okay. So, again, what we then see is that this leads to essentially sort of not just the question of, okay, what was the nature of the ideological sort of debate that's taking place? Is that ideological or is it about distribution? Again, it leads, I think, to this fear of conversion, and then, of course, the argument is that it leads to the sort of the support for illiberal policies. Okay, and so how do we see that, right? We see that in Egypt, again, to say that what we've ended up with is this contestation over the institutions, right? You know, you saw that from essentially the very, very beginning, right? We saw that with if you can sort of walk through the history, right, the very first thing that happened is the constitutional referendum, which leads to the Constitution, the Constitution First Amendment sort of movement, right, which says, you know, we need to actually have the Constitution in place so that we don't let the voters essentially kind of, or the Islamist success undermine this. That's taking its place as early as May and June, right? And what that means is there was already a fear that the representative institutions would return something that would ultimately lead to the undermining of democracy. That was the concern among those who were supporting that. And again, going back to what you already know, right? The sort of the Alumni document, which essentially tries to protect, especially safeguard in that case, the military's prerogatives, the disbandment of parliament, the constitutional referendum, and sort of all of the events of November 2012, in which there's again sort of just this willingness to push through and undermine the institutions in an ability and in an interest of trying to make sure that one side or the other actually gets what it wants. Which leads ultimately, right, to not just the sort of that followed by the kind of the associational laws that had everybody up in arms right before finally the overthrow of Morsi. Right, so the process itself, this is what I want to argue, is as different, right, as it is about the outcome itself. Right? The Tunisian case, of course, we see that this is an ideological divide. It's the conflicts that become partly over regional inequalities, but a lot of also about the sort of this Islamist secularists. And so you get these kind of smaller scale sort of stresses, some of the smaller scale sort of tensions that again mirror both what happens in Libya and what happened in Egypt, but neither one of them at the same level, right? So you know, you get a proposed blasphemy clause, you get the sort of the issues around the roles of women and the women in the Constitution, which would be sort of the late summer, and then the demonstrations, of course, that more recently, and all of the kind of the calls against the government, and then the government debates and negotiations. But all of that in some ways is kind of the miniature of both what's taking place in Libya and in Tunisia. And then in Libya, of course, we get these constant sort of, you know, real sort of threats. And the great fear, and I think it's a reasonable fear, of kind of the going past the point of no return and into civil war. Now, when I say that, and I have to say that one of the things that Libyans do that I think is very, very interesting is they are very aware of not so much that there's less of a debate over the institutions, but they're very aware of trying to use institutions in some way to alleviate some of these problems, right? So in addition to the discussion about federalism, for example, you see a lot of work, even, for example, with the electoral law, where they come up with an electoral law that for the vast majority of electoral experts seems like a disaster. It's a parallel system, right? So you have PR seats and you have individual constituency seats. So it's parallel in that sense, except for some districts are only PR and some districts are only IC, and you look at it, you think this makes no sense. You look at it more closely and you realize that that was done exactly in a way that was to reduce the tensions between these different localities. Right? So there's a sense in which institutions are not at risk in terms of being undermined, but they are at play in terms of being used to try to diffuse these tensions. So there's two ways of thinking about what I'm trying to convince you of, right? One is, what does this mean for sort of transition theories? What are the lessons from a theoretical point of view, right? I think one lesson from a theoretical point of view is that when it comes to the debate about Islam and democracy, that it's not about Islam in terms of theological basis or underpinnings that sort of matters, but it really is about the fear of Islamists, right? So it's a question of when all of a sudden the concern that Islamists winning today will mean that they've sort of undermined the system tomorrow, and that this is just kind of the skepticism that's so palpable in Egypt about what Islamists will do if they stay in power, right, is the part that's important in terms of understanding why it is that they were then interested in undermining institutions. People who are very strongly committed to democracy being very interested in seeing the fall of an elected president in order to sustain democracy, right? That is itself being driven by this fear. The second thing, of course, is that ideas and ideology matter. And they matter in ways that I think that most of the literature on transitions and democratization has tended to overlook, right? So, occasionally there's a sense, for example, that ideological sort of cleavages exist or are there, but most of the idea is about sort of thinking about Democrats, hardliners, and moderates, thinking about sort of these kinds of degrees of difference on the spectrum, but not so much about thinking about what types of differences are really at stake and how much do I think that a person can be switched across them, right, or can be transformed. Third, of course, is that I think that it's important then not to think about this as being about Islamists and secularists or about being about regional differences and debates, but really about being about two different types of cleavage. One about being about transformative, kind of universal, what I think is targets of contestation or debates, and the other is being about distributive and particularistic ones. And so we can start to think about other types of debates and other types of cleavages during transitions and the implications that they would have. And finally, I don't know why it says 1, 2, 1, 1, by the way, but that's okay. And finally, I think it makes us think that we should recognize the difference between revolutions and transitions. We talk about these things almost as if they're either interchangeable or with very sort of, kind of in the average discussions, with really kind of little thinking behind them, right? So, there's a question about whether or not there had been a revolution in Tunisia or not. There's the discussion about the color revolutions, right? The Orange Revolution. I mean, what really is revolutionary about the Orange Revolution? And the reality is there's not much, right? And so political transitions need to be separated when it's about who has power and what's taking place from kind of revolutions of the social revolution type that Scotch Pool or others have talked about, where it's really about transforming the very nature of society as well as changing the political game, right? And we have to recognize that distinction in order, essentially, I think, not only to be clear with our theories and recognize what we should compare to what, but also to think about what we should do in terms of democratization, right? So there's both a theoretical implication and then I think there's a policy implication. And the policy implication is to say, first of all, this is a case of what, right? I mean, this is a transitional contest or this is a revolutionary contest, and that we have very different, outcomes and processes that are associated with them. And similarly, that we have very different sort of tensions and threats, right? Is this a case of distribution where the threat is about arms, or is this a case of transformation where the threat is about institutions, right? It also makes us think, okay, even if you're talking within and this is why Tunisia is useful, even if we're talking about within the case of where ideological tensions are at play, what kinds of things can matter then, right? So one thing obviously that can matter is when it's a smaller gap and people are therefore less afraid of the other side winning, right? Because the change is not going to be as major. That is in play. You could wonder if there's questions about third-party enforcers. We can talk about whether or not institutional rules matter, right? Does it matter that you had sort of more of a troika in Tunisia than you had, in Egypt? So there's a lot of, I think, different ways in which once we've sort of distinguished what class we're in, we can think about what are the implications of that for policy. And finally, I promised you all that I would talk very briefly, but I think more in our Q&A, about what this means with regards to, for example, Syria or Jordan or elsewhere. And I think that this is the interesting thing is it's not simply to say this is what's happened in Tunisia or this is what's happened in Libya, right? But to think about, okay, what does this mean, for example, with regards to Syria? You know, 5 years ago, I would have told you that I thought that Syria was more of a geographically distinguished, you know, that the cleavages that would have mattered in Syria ultimately, despite the Alawi Sunni, right, but that's essentially kind of a fairly small minority, that ultimately the cleavages that would have mattered were going to be more about sort of geographical and regional cleavages. You know, and that historically had been the case. That was the things that sort of led to the coups and counter-coups in the 1940s and 1950s. It had long been that there was a sort of people, you know, people were surprised when Daraa had you know, uprisings, and the idea that somebody actually outside of Daraa wouldn't just say, well, Ladian, Darian, Shubnafiyum, that was an important difference, right? So there is a sense in which you can say, okay, if it had happened, if the transition had taken place in 2011, that's what I would tell you. I mean, the second way of thinking about it is, given the sort of what has become very clearly strengthening of the debate and divide between Islamists and secularists, that very much could emerge as a divide and the kind of the political cleavage that follows whatever outcome that we end up looking at, right? So I can't tell you what would be the cleavage, right? I can tell you what I think would be the impact of one versus the other becoming becoming sort of the major point of contestation. And again, we could talk about that with Jordan or elsewhere, but I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and your comments. Thanks.
We have some time for Q&A. I think there is a wireless microphone floating around.
Here, float.
Hi, I'm Walid Hezbollah. I teach international relations here at AUB. I had when you have these like surveys about people's views and so forth, the question I kind of think about is, you know, why are they this way? Like, how do we explain that? What is the background? What role do institutions play in that? So that's the question. One of the things I had. Another thing that when you take your cases and line them up, one simple way of just mapping on your categories seems to me, and I don't follow this as close, the literature as closely anymore, was basically the institutional mobilization of Islamist parties. I mean, in Libya, you don't have any. In Tunisia, you have it. It's sort of underground. It was repressed. In Egypt, you did have fairly robust. Considering for the region, much more robust organizations within Islamist movements and parties. And then, so within the intermediary case of Tunisia, you mentioned the sort of regional issues, which regional and class and so forth. And the other thing to add to that, seems to me, would be, again, these institutions. You did have a labor movement that got co-opted, but also had a base as something separate institutionally, even though it got co-opted, that it could, it was an institution that after the revolution or whatever could begin to debate about how much autonomous it would be. And yeah, I suppose the other thing about the secular, the Borghese secular movement, I don't know how much that's the powerful force and how much the legacy of that is, in the sense that you did have, the labor movement, you did have like lawyers and professional associations that, again, this is my guess just from not studying it closely at the moment, but that those kind of prerogatives that one might call secular are embedded. But while in Egypt, I'm assuming many of those movements were, for a time, professional associations were dominated by Islamists until there was another conflict. So, I was just saying that's one way I see, kind of mapping on to your categories, a story that might look at those institutions, and then the hypothesis might be, are those opinions based on these, the institutional sort of saliency and organization that these movements had, in the past.
Right, or their mobilization of them, right? That's actually, that's the perfect point, yeah, exactly right. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much. The categories that you mentioned, which are all very clear from these different countries, Islamist, religious, secular, tribal, geographic, and ideological. One of the things that I found striking in the Arab world in the last 40 years, and not necessarily since the revolutions, but like when I lived in Jordan for many years, you could see people who jumped across these identities. Somebody who lived in a rural area identified with a geographic region, or with Islamism, or with Ba'athist communist movements, or with Transjordanian nationalism, or with Arab nationalism. And sometimes individuals would go back and forth over time, depending on which of these identities or these movements brought them whatever they wanted. So how do you see the fluidity among these categories, and do you see these as pretty fixed categories, or will we see new ones emerging? Perhaps, for instance, trade unions and professional associations might emerge sometime in the future.
So actually your two questions are related in a sense. I'm sorry. Both mics. Okay. Is that good? Okay. So both of these questions are related, right? Because I'm not by any means seeing them as necessarily fixed. I mean, I think there is, and actually, first of all, I'm not seeing them as fixed, and I'm seeing the expectations of what people think would happen, for example, if Islamists came into power, as being as important as what their real platforms would be, right? So I think, this is more about, it's more about expectations, and in terms of the fixity, it's about what's being mobilized. And that's why I say your two questions are linked, right? Because it is also a question of what institutions were strong enough to start to shape the debate. And I would argue shape the debate not only, for example, in Egypt, because the Muslim Brothers were out there and able to make the calls. And in fact, the interesting thing about the brothers, I'm not going to be defending them in a sense, right? But, if you look at the vote and you look at sort of the campaigns during the elections, it was not really about Islam as the solution, right? I mean, it was a very sort of nuts and bolts campaigns, and the voting was was very umbrella in terms of who voted for the brothers. If you look at the Constitution itself, I mean, you can have issues with it, but it wasn't this sort of major kind of theocratic constitution. So it's less about but why did the Muslim Brothers being strong actually then help mobilize this cleavage? And I would argue it was partly because of the fact that they were strong and they could do something, right? And it was also because it then counter-mobilized the secularists also as a block in terms of thinking about that as being the issue. And you're right. If you had stronger unions out there that were, I mean, and there was also some debate about economic distribution, but not nearly as much as you would have expected from a place where everybody was saying this is about the economy, right? So if those institutions or those organizations were out there to try to make that kind of an argument, and as they are, right, with the UJTT and Tunisia, then I think then people would start to sort of be seeing the political contest along those lines as well. So absolutely, I don't see this as being necessarily that people are fixed in these positions. I think they can also be, this kind of narrower gap in one place or the moderate sort of positions. Again, and if we think this is partly about salience, right, that also helps to understand if this is not the issue that you're thinking about, then you have less of a strong position on it. So I think all of those things are kind of intertwined. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Niels Hagerdal. I'm a PhD student at Harvard, currently visiting at AUB.
Good.
So I had a question about Libya. You said in your study you make the claim that it's because it has this deep division that goes back a really long time. But I'm a little curious, because as you hint, it could also just be that oil is what's kind of creating these divisions because people who live in one part of the country want to keep the oil for themselves. So even though I see where you're saying that these three parts were lumped together into one state, Great Libya, isn't that the case of most Arab states, that they're somewhat arbitrarily created? And are there other kind of divisions? I mean, are there any Tripolitanian nationalists or Syrian nationalists out there? Or could you address that question a little bit more, whether it's just about oil creating these divisions between these different parts of the country?
There's definitely Syrian nationalists out there, right, including holding a kind of a constitutional independence days and sort of calling for discussion on the anniversary of independence. So no, there's definitely, this is not simply about oil distribution. I mean, obviously that underlies it, and I think that's part of it, right? I think you wouldn't have it be as easy to mobilize if there wasn't also the sense of we've been shafted in the past and we're going to redress this. But it is also not only about oil, because there is definitely an identity and there is definitely a way in which they've done surveys on this, right? And these are not ours, but others. And it is true that not everybody in Cyrenaica is a Cyrenaican nationalist, right? But that's a very different thing than saying, are there Cyrenaican nationalists to be out mobilizing and holding militias and threatening sort of the succession of Cyrenaica? And that's definitely the case. Yeah. So So your point is well taken. Obviously, there's a lot of arbitrariness, and regionalism, regionalism in a sense exists in all three of these cases, right? I'm not saying that it doesn't, and it exists in some ways in Egypt as well. So that's true, but the mobilization of it, right, I think has a lot to do with this confluence of the very clear history that you can draw back on that's not even all that long ago, combined with the distribution of rents.
Hi, I'm Piotr Niziński, PhD student in Jagiellonian University in Krakow. I got a question connected with Egypt because I was with the research team from my university in Egypt this year on February and January. We focus mostly on street art and other anthropological things like youth expectation, also politological. But my question is, you know maybe the Egyptian singer Rami Issam, he sing Irhal song. And then he rewrite this song, sing Irhal to leave to the armed forces, then leave to the President Morsi. Now he sing leave to the current policy. And if you think this is great threat into democratization, this situation of permanent wants to living, because when we talking to the youth in Egypt, especially youth to the Cairo University, not AUC in Cairo, they seem that they see no change. They see no change at all, and they see no one who would fill the expectation. If you think this is a great threat into the process of democratization in Egypt, this is my question. Thank you.
I give a very short answer. No, not really, obviously. I mean, I think this is one of the problems, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh.
Thanks so much. I loved it. When you mentioned the Orange Revolution, I just wonder whether, I mean, one of the things that's come up repeatedly, and I have a lot of friends in Egypt sort of across the spectrum, is this question of whether, Morsi was removed by a coup d'etat. And we're seeing something in Venezuela where the government is sort of usurping and modifying democratic institutions. And it would be an interesting question whether if you had the president removed by the military, that would constitute a coup d'etat. Yet, in some cases, say Latin America, Chile, comes to mind. We seem to know what a coup d'etat is. And since you kind of opened the door to talk comparatively beyond the Arab world, I wonder if you would take, just walk us through the case for it having been a coup d'etat and against.
For Egypt, you mean?
Yeah, for Egypt, and the case of Morsi, because I'm not quite sure what I think about it, though I have friends of good faith sort of across the political spectrum, who seem very sure that it was or it was not a coup. So where might that fit in with your model?
Yeah. In terms of how it fits in with the model I'm purporting, it essentially it's in some very sad way, it was the perfect conclusion to what I would expect to happen in Egypt. In fact, this project had started, and the argument had started to be written. I have a December 2012 piece that sort of lays out the very brief parts of it, and past that. And when I call it a coup, frankly, when the coup took place, it was exactly the, kind of the conclusion, actually, of the book manuscript, right? So, and why was that? It was because that was the evidence of an entire set, and I would argue of Democrats. I mean, of people who literally do like democracy. So one of the implications of this is we think that you can get democracy without Democrats, but we also now think you can get autocracy with Democrats, and we have to keep that in mind. People can want democracy, but also fear that the alternative is worse, right? So, or that democracy is worse than the alternative, I should say. But so in that sense, it was the exact example of the fear of the, what would happen with Islamists staying in power, and the kind of the democratic institutions continuing to function as normal, sort of from the segment of the population that wasn't benefiting from them. That would be my argument about what that was and what it looked like. And is it a coup in the sense that it's the military coming in and taking power? I think you cannot argue that it was in any ways not a coup. Now,
is there a segment of the population that is supportive of that? Obviously. And was it such a large segment that we can essentially say that what was taking place in the streets was the equivalent of going to the ballot boxes, which is an argument that a lot of people wanted to make? You know, that was the majority of Egyptians. I mean, if I do the math, and I know we've got 85 million Egyptians, and we've got, you know, roughly, 45 million of them of voting age, and you've got, you know, and we've got, you know, I just don't see that we had more than 20 million people in the streets who were not including people under voting age. I mean, so essentially, like, can we use that as a ballot box? I don't think we can use it as a ballot box. So I'm not willing, and I think the second piece of evidence that you shouldn't think of it as the ballot box was that there was concerns being expressed, right? And you can argue this is partly about the nature of elections, but that if you were to go straight to elections again, you would only return the brothers again, right? So certainly people didn't have, there were a lot of people who had voted for the brothers in the first election who would never vote for them again. And I know personally a lot of people who are in that position. So certainly a lot of people had switched who they were willing to vote for, right? But that said, even with that, it's not clear to me that we can simply pretend that that was balloting by another means, or that it was showing the majority of the will, because we can also make arguments about both majoritarianism and electoral politics. So, yeah.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm a PhD student at Yale, and I have two questions. And the first one is trying to conceptualize what your spectrum is that you're using to place Egypt across from Libya with Tunisia in the middle. And I'm not clear if the variation that we observe there is in, or that you're conceiving of there, is in the means through which actors struggled for political change or the ends that they were seeking for political change. And in both of those ways, I'm not sure how Tunisia falls in the middle, because if we're thinking about actors who are struggling through violent versus institutional means for control, then I think you could make the case that Egypt actually saw more violent means for change, and especially most recently. But I mean, people in the street, that is a threat of violence to the state, and then a coup, even if it hadn't turned into the bloody mess that it is now, is also a threat of violence. It's a violent means for change. And so I would say that in terms of means, Egypt might be between Tunisia and Libya. And if it's about the goals, then I would say that possibly Egypt and Tunisia are very similar in that both people were struggling for control of institutions, not simply control of violence. Whereas in Libya, it's control of violence. And then my second question is about Libya specifically, and I just wonder is there sort of, this is like a falsification of your theory question, is there a way that Libya could have turned out differently? Because it seems like there weren't institutions after the fall of Gaddafi for people to struggle over. So the only struggle that they could have is one with violence for the control of violence.
So, good questions. And the depressing thing about your first question is it is neither of the above. It is neither about outcomes nor about means. But actually what I'm trying to make say is that there is a difference in terms of what people think is at stake. What they think is the primary struggle that's taking place. And that primary struggle, right, whether it is about the distribution of resources or whether it is about the nature of what is society, what is Egyptian or what is Tunisian, and the ways in which society should sort of live. And that's why I say this is actually, in that sense, revolutionary and about social transformation, right? That struggle leads to a sort of a decision over whether or not you kind of hedge your bets by, and hedge through trying to sort of make sure you hold military power as well as try to, use institutions to recruit, right? Or whether or not you sort of think that the struggle can take place through institutions and recruitment. Right now, that factor leads to then the extent to which either institutions or arms become both the major possibility for democracy, but also the major targets of what you're trying to, the major problems for democracy, right? And that then, of course, leads to, now your point about Egypt, okay, that's as bloody and violent now as Libya in a sense, right? I think is actually a very good point, and honestly, I don't have a good answer for that at the moment, but in many ways, right, the process, especially up to this point of, this is about trying to use these institutions to change things, is more about, is is more than about sort of the return and resort to authoritarianism and the demolishing of those institutions than it is about the use of arms to get what you want. Now, your second question, if it was, does Libya has so little institutions to begin with, so in a sense, of course it can't be about institutions, is an interesting one. I disagree somewhat, and I disagree because it is true, obviously, that the GNC, nobody is going to tell you it's strong and it's out there making all sorts of policies that are just going to shape what's happening with Libyans. It's clearly not, right? Arguably, it's a harder one to sort of do as a counterfactual, but I think, one could argue that while it's true that, laws don't have the same kind of grip, it's also not, I don't think it's fair to say that if you had a really restrictive association law, or if you had a really restrictive media law, that people could simply break it, that they have absolutely no teeth, right? And what you find, interestingly, is there's quite liberal association laws and quite liberal, media laws, and it's not a fight. It's not a fight about those, right? Any more than it really is kind of a fight about the GNC. It's a fight about this taken into another realm. Yeah.
Yes. My name is Mohammed Hanafi. I'm from the Egyptian embassy here in Beirut. I came here today hoping that this issue of coup, not a coup, wouldn't come up, but now that it has, I have to say something about it. I won't argue for or against, because there are arguments on both sides of the aisle. The counter-argument to your point that if it was a coup, is that you have to look at this, it's a very complicated issue. It's not easy to define which way it went. But when the military intervened on June 30th, basically, the number one priority for it was to actually prevent the civil war between the two sides, basically, Islamists and their opponents. And one could argue, the counter-argument is that, while the previous president was elected democratically, he didn't rule democratically. And I won't go through different phases, but I'll just point to, how a constitution was basically cooked in 2 days and passed that has certain values that doesn't really conform with Egyptian values. How incitement was made in the presence of the former president against his opponents. There are a lot of arguments. But what I'd also like to throw out there, just two arguments. One is, it's ironic how when in the first revolution, January 25th in 2011, when the military basically stepped in again and pushed Mubarak to step down, and took power, that wasn't regarded as a coup at the time, while on June 30th, when the military stepped in and handed over power to a civilian authority, that was regarded by many as a coup. So it's just, I'm not trying to say you're wrong and I'm wrong, I'm just trying to say that it's much more complicated than that. But having given that, just that argument that I had to make, let me just ask you, you gave a good snapshot of where things are in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya. But I'd be interested in hearing your views on how you see things moving ahead in the coming period, basically, of the three revolutions. Where do you think they will end? That's my question.
Good question. And a hard question, obviously. I mean, one of the things I'm not trying to make a deterministic argument. I'm trying to say what are the ways in which the issues that arise and are at present, right? And we can, again, I invite us to think about what the kinds of the context and how that then shapes these struggles. What are the ways in which those shape the struggles that are at hand, right? So my concern with the sort of the kind of either democracy or authoritarian stability, all these things as being the kind of the final point that we all point to and want to sort of explain, essentially, right? Is that in many ways there's, I think, a lot of different sort of directions that can be taken, a lot of different paths, and to some extent it's actually quite stochastic. And I'm not trying to just sort of wave my hands and ignore a really, really good question, but I want to make it clear that I don't think that I can simply say, well, in Egypt, here's what's going to happen, and in Libya, here's what's going to happen. Now, the implication of this argument, right, at least in the sort of the shorter term, is to say, if something happens in Egypt, right, here's what it will look like. And so let me give you those, right? So the implication for Libya is if something happens that breaks down in Libya, it's actually more likely to go through a bloody sort of kind of war period, and then to get to something else, right? The implication, and I'm putting Egypt last because I find it the hardest, okay? So that's fair. The implication for Tunisia is actually, you know, to expect this kind of continued muddling through, right? Institutions don't break down so fully that they're not being used as a place for negotiation, which I think, by the way, is a very positive thing, right? You know, there's a sense in which there's obviously kind of an increasing struggle. It's an interesting one in that many people don't even think of this as being possibly by, you know, Tunisians doing this. So certainly there's a lot of challenges to be met, but I expect the same kind of, you know, slow and, you know, slow halting at times, stepping back and then stepping forward, but nevertheless kind of progression to something that people will continue to think of as very imperfect. I see Tunisia in that way is very similar to, for example, to Kenya, right? Where, you know, it's got the institutions, a lot of stuff happens outside of it, some things happen inside of it, it kind of muddles through and, you know, ideally in the long run strengthens. Egypt, and I would love you to help me out on what to expect in Egypt, to be honest with you. But that's partly because I think that the military intervention, I will use that word for now, was in some ways a game changer, right? And it's very, I mean, my expectation, but it's not one that derives sort of nice and neat from this theory, because in some ways I think it's just to say, okay, we're starting over now. What does become the basis at which people are starting to think of things? And in some ways you could say, okay, it strengthens the Islamist secularist divide, and that only means that we are back into a world where the secularists are willing to sort of accept, you know, kind of a more restrictive regime, and the Islamists are unable to kind of combat that or to do anything about it, and so we're kind of back into a Mubarak or pre-Mubarak period. That's one expectation, and that's probably, I think, quite, it makes a lot of sense. The thing that it misses is that we're assuming that that period is as stable, both in terms of that, you know, that the brothers and supporters and those who are going to fragment off from them are willing to simply accept it and think that they can't do anything different, so that it's not going to look like either the early 1990s and the mid-1990s of Egypt, or it's going to look like the worse the 1990s of Algeria. So I actually have I think I have the more optimistic sort of scenario, at least that I can see, is one of sort of re-authoritarianization, okay, or at least in the short run. And the less optimistic scenario is one in which that explodes into a higher level of violence. But I would love to hear your take on it. I'm very serious about that.
It's too difficult to say, for obvious reasons. One of the main problems is that we seem to be reinventing the wheel every time, every few months or so, by going back to square one again, which is, okay, a new wave of revolution. And there are many people who are talking about a new wave of revolution that's happening again because of what you just described. And the main and the common ground in all of these new waves of revolution is always the Egyptian youth that were the igniters of the first revolution, because they can't seem to find their place. Now, the Egyptian youth are the future of Egypt, and eventually they will end up determining how Egypt will go. And as a result, I'm positive, I'm hopeful that they will end up having the final say in Egypt's future towards democracy and the principles that we want to get to. But as you said, it's too difficult to determine, and it will take time. I mean, January 25th revolution really started a very deep transformation in Egyptian society. We are still trying to identify who we are, what's the Egyptian political identity in the 21st century. That battle is going to continue for some time, but I'm hopeful in the end the Egyptian youth will rise up to the challenge and get what they want.
My question is looking at Egypt in particular, and one thing I've always been sort of curious about with kind of the structure of the government falling, or the structure of the government as well as the executive falling, is why why in a country with such a strong history of kind of authoritarianism and a clear fear amongst, like, within Egyptian society that it would revert back to authoritarianism, do you have kind of the formation of a presidential system? It always seemed to me that a parliamentary system might do a bit more to sort of mitigate or alleviate some of these fears, and I also think it would have provided kind of perhaps a more efficient system instead of having to kind of revert back to these revolutions or coups or whatever you want to call it. So it might have given a mechanism to sort of deal with you could replace a prime minister more easily and kind of have a new round of elections. So I was just curious kind of what was maybe some of the rationale behind the presidential system, and what are sort of some of the critiques of alternative democratic structures?
Actually, this is actually, in a sense, it opens us up for a greater critique of the literature about parliamentarism and presidentialism, and not in the sense of, was Lynn, sort of bless his soul, right or wrong, right? But in the sense that we have an expectation that you can engineer institutions, right? So either whether we're talking about electoral institutions or, should they choose presidential or parliamentary sort of executive legislative relations, et cetera, and that those end up being almost like you start from a blank slate. So there's a large literature that almost makes that kind of a suggestion, right? And what we see actually is two things. One is that these institutions, I think, are sort of result as a combination both of what people feel comfortable and know. So historically, I think there's a sort of kind of strong path dependency of these institutions, so that on that mark, what happened, of course, in Egypt was that what you knew as presidentialism. And so there's a lot, for a lot of Egyptians, the whole notion that you would have a parliament doesn't make any more sense than the notion that the United States would have a parliament, which arguably could be a good thing. But people just simply can't, you can't wrap your mind around it. And so there's a whole segment of the population, I think including political elites, for whom that was simply kind of a non-starter. And then the other part of what, when you really get institutional change, is about the relations, the relative power, right? So the relative power of actors. And you had no real sort of strong counter to the strength of the brothers that would force them to have to kind of really contend and to consider another set of institutions. So it's less about, okay, what's the kind of the rational arguments of how would these institutions work, right? But I think much more about what are the ways in which these institutions actually are formed and made. And in that perspective, there's no reason to really think that, Bruce Ackerman, one of my colleagues, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about why, I read it in sort of July of this last year, why they should now take a parliament. And maybe it's a nice idea and it sounds very good, but it's just really hard to imagine, right? So I think that's my take on it.
If there aren't any other questions, or are there any other questions?
Now you know there are no other questions.
Thank you, Ellen, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future.